Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and I'm joined by Drs. Rod Rosenblatt, Scott Keith, Adam Francisco, and a guest again. You're doctor, right? Dr. Wade Johnston.
Yes, I am.
Way to know your guest.
You know, I have to wonder because some people I'm call doctor, and then I learn it they're just not just, but they're a pastor or a professor.
They're just a person.
Yeah. Sometimes sometimes you call somebody pastor and they're like, oh no, I'm doctor, and you're like, oh man, this is
Oh brother.
how do you keep these straight?
I think that movie line, doctor.
Is that just starting the show like that? Is that snobbery? Somebody should send me an email. Is it snobbery to highlight that every episode? I don't know.
I was on a flight once, and they asked if there was a doctor on board, and my wife got really mad because I raised my hand, and they said, what kind of doctor? And I said, 16th century intellectual history. And that wasn't what they were looking for.
That's like that that kid's cartoon movie that Mom loves, Caleb, with Johnny Resnick sings all the songs. It's a treasure planet,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the character in there who's got a PhD in physics, somebody says, is there a doctor in the house? He goes, I'm a doctor, but I'm not the useful kind.
That's right.
I'm not the one that can do anything.
So today we're doing we were doing history of the Christian church via great thinkers of the Christian faith a while ago, before the summer.
Rewinding a little bit.
And then we moved into Reformation topics for the preparation for the Here We Still Stand conference. And I think you could think of this episode as kind of one of the overlap ones, like the Luther one or the Melanchthon one, because we're doing historical Lutheran, right? We're doing Matthias Flacius.
Flacius.
Yes. We're gonna conquer another great thinker of the Christian faith. Controversial.
We have Wade here, and
there's
he's one of only two living Flacius scholars that I'm aware of that have done real work in Matthias Flacius.
The other Olson?
Oliver Olson, who's now in a nursing home.
And Olson really just has done so much with him. It's amazing. There's one in Germany.
Well,
actually.
you're not 80 yet.
No,
so we'll give you time.
There's a Croatian scholar who actually is a pastor in Germany now who has done some very good work with Flacius.
I was talking America.
Yeah, Luka Illich, but not in the America setting then. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit on the last episode that you were on there, Wade, that there's some tension between Melanchthon and Flacius. So maybe you guys, Dr. Keith and Dr.
I
and
think it'd be
Dr.
fun
Johnston can get the gloves on.
For Wade just to tell us the story. I mean, because if Melanchthon's an unknown character, Flacius is certainly an unknown character, even more so. Really, when people think about Lutheranism, they think really one guy, Martin Luther. And there's a whole cast of characters that sort of go by the wayside in people's view of how and why the Reformation occurred. Melanchthon, Staupitz. There's just there's a whole host of them. Bugenhagen. I mean, there's just all sorts of people here that were involved in one way or another. Even Zwingli and Calvin, right? Maybe not Calvin, but they get lost in the mix. And in the Lutheran Reformation, I mean, there's some real heroes here. I think of Justus Jonas, right? Luther's pastor, famous translator of both Luther and Melanchthon.
Yep.
I mean, Jonas took Melanchthon's Latin and brought it into German that people could actually read.
Yeah.
And famous for saying things like what Melanchthon says in one Latin sentence takes me 5 German sentences to translate. Yeah. There's just people like this, and Flacius is certainly one of them. And so I thought maybe just tell our listeners the story. Why did you study this guy? Why is he important? What did he do? He's known as sort of the maybe co-opted leader of what we call the Gymnasio Lutherans, or the authentic or the real Lutherans after Luther's death. So,
also, in our last episode, you mentioned you drank PBR. At some point, could you address why on earth you drink PBR?
Dude, no, don't trash PBR. Whoa.
It did win a blue ribbon, you've heard, right?
That can be edited out.
That was in 1895, but still.
I'd like to apologize to all people listening back home in Milwaukee for the diss on the Pabst family.
All right. Okay, Flacius.
It's been in my head ever since we recorded the last episode.
I like it. I get plenty of grief back home for PBR too. So Wisconsin's got enough craft brews now.
Caleb and I recently did a PBR/Miller Lite challenge to see if you could tell the difference.
I was very confident that PBR would win out, and I couldn't tell the difference.
You could not tell
blindfolded. It was I was sad about it. I was really upset.
You got to practice more with the PBR.
Philistines.
Good grief.
All right, Flacius.
I just real quick, just so you know, Adam, seminary beer for us was Beast. So even a step down from PBR.
Oh, my goodness.
So I started off with the Beast, with Milwaukee's Best, and I've refined my taste to PBR. So a few years I might be, who
Pretty
knows where.
soon he'll be drinking Coors Light.
Yeah. But Flacius and I,
You got to get a picture of Dr. Rose. Sorry, I brought it up.
That I like it. I like it. Flacius, and people can say his name how they want. I had a committee that I think everybody said it differently. My Dr. Vader who taught in the Netherlands. My PhD was joined, and part of it was Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So it's kind of interesting passing a bunch of Erasmus statues studying Luther.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
I hissed a little bit sometimes, but I also
Yeah.
I felt bad for him sometimes too. And
We
he
can't
needed a good
discount
pastor. He needed a good
Erasmus's
pastor.
contribution to the Reformation. though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he was just a guy who needed a pastor, and Luther tried to be that and find into the will. But
Well, where would the Reformation be without the critical edition of the New Testament?
true.
That's right. Luther used it with all his students.
Yep.
But one of them insisted it was Flacius. One of them insisted it was Flacius. And in Wisconsin, we like to say Flacius. So
I'm going to go with gymnesticans just to annoy the LCMS. Flacius.
and Flacius is just in my blood. So I don't know if anybody else has a pronunciation they want to use, but he actually is from what would be Croatia today. I got to actually see the town he was from to present at a conference a couple years ago, and the Reformation had spread down there somewhat, and he had an uncle who was a monk, Baldo Lupentino, who the Inquisition condemns as a Lutheran, but basically every heretic was just a Lutheran.
Yeah.
And this was under the influence of Venice, so Lupentino was eventually drowned as part of the Venetian Inquisition, but he had told Flacius that he should go north and study Lutheran theology. And so Flacius would make his way north and actually returns later with a letter from the Schmalkaldic League asking for his uncle's release. And his uncle had supposedly told him, don't recant but sing. And so he makes his way north, has several stops along the way, but makes it to Wittenberg to study theology. While he's at Wittenberg, he has a crisis of conscience. He falls into depression. And this is during Luther's life, and so it's Luther that counsels him. His relationship with Luther then was very pastoral, not just academic. And he's a student of Melanchthon, lives with Melanchthon, works as kind of like his grad student.
I have a question. So recently, Caleb and I were in Norway, and one of the presentations, and Jim Nestian was there, one of the presentations Jim gave, he said something that I had never heard before about Flacius. I got to keep it up. He said he originally came to Wittenberg to study astrology with Melanchthon. Is that true?
He said that about Chemnitz, not about Flacius.
I'm so wrong. Thank you.
I was going to say, Flacius does poke a little fun at astrology in one of his writings. He almost never mentions Melanchthon, but he says, some counsel that the emperor is going to die on this said date anyway, so we should just compromise for now and then we'll be fine. And he says, based on the stars and what he's doing there, is kind of poking. Melanchthon had actually thought, based on astrology, this was going to happen. I don't know, he was a Hebraist, so he studied Hebrew.
Okay, yeah.
And he actually never spoke German very well. He didn't, he would have taught in Hebrew or in Latin. And so he studies under Melanchthon. He lives with Melanchthon for a while. When the later controversies are happening, he's kind of working as like a, going through letters with Melanchthon, stuff like this. That's how he's kind of finding out what's happening. But he becomes a convinced Lutheran, gets a job teaching at Wittenberg, teaching Hebrew. Melanchthon gets him a gig, actually, I believe when the plague, I think, struck is why they had to go elsewhere. And Melanchthon says, you've got to hire this great polyglot at the school, whatever the case may be. He speaks many languages, and they're good friends, which will lead to Melanchthon's central betrayal later. But really, what's fascinating is that you have someone from Southern Europe who ends up in Germany and in many ways working, as Oliver Olsen says, for the survival of the Lutheran Reformation. Now people will dispute, how much Flacius should get credit for that. I tend to think a fair amount. But why I studied him is I was at the St. Louis Seminary. I don't know why I was there, and there was a pastor, Missouri Synod pastor, Dave Jewell, and he said, I was reading the Book of Concord, and there was this interesting footnote. And I believe it was the Formula. Article 10 cites about adiaphora by Flacius. And he said someone should translate that. So I found it and I decided to work on it. And then I thought, this is really interesting. So when I ended up back in grad school, that's what I decided to do. And you kind of don't know what you're doing when you start. You just pick something, hope your professor seems happy with it, and then you live with it for 6 years.
And what did you actually research? What part of Flacius history and or theology?
From Luther's death until the siege of Magdeburg, and the emperor is pushed back out of Germany, and so the adiaphoristic controversy, and because the program was transnational, I compared it with a vestment controversy that broke out in England at the same time among those influenced by Zwingli, and for both of them, the vestment, the surplice, became one of the signs of the fighting over it. Flacius and some of the Gymnasios had said, we're free to wear whatever vestments we want, but if the government tells us we have to wear the surplice, then the devil's behind the surplice and we shouldn't wear it. And in England, John Hooper is going to get consecrated bishop, and he had been a refugee under Henry in Zurich and influenced by Zwingli, and he says no vestments are wrong. He has a great line where he says, Jesus hung naked on the cross, so we shouldn't wear vestments, which I've always been tempted to take that logic to its extreme there. What maybe pastors should wear, but
Please don't.
yeah, but he says so it's wrong to wear vestments, and so the dissertation looked a lot at what are the Lutheran approaches to these things in the Christian freedom.
Yeah, and so out of that we get in the formula the article on adiaphora.
Right.
On adiaphora, right, which basically says kind of the same thing, right? That
Adopts Flacius' position.
yeah, many things are in the church are adiaphora. That is that they are neither commanded nor forbidden by Scripture, and follow good order in our history of how we've done things. And unless there's a reason for changing, maybe keep what's going on and what keeps the people comfortable. But as soon as somebody tells you that you have to do something that is adiaphora, your confessional stand is then to not do that thing. And right?
Yeah, and I grew up in the Catholic Church until I was about 18, so a lot of my family's still Catholic. So if I'm going out with them on a Friday in Lent, I'm probably not going to order meat, so as to not cause offense. But if one of my well-meaning aunts or uncles or cousins were to say, it's a sin to eat meat on Fridays in Lent, even though I'm not a big steak guy, I'm going to have two.
Yeah.
Yeah. If Adam were to say it's a sin and drink PBR, now I've got to get a tall boy.
Which he has.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So what are some of Flacius' most well-read works in his time? I mean, nothing really is read much now in English at least, but in his time
we can work on that. But Flacius is in many ways a father of patristics, of church history, of hermeneutics. His clavis, his key to sacred scripture, which I think 1517 now has from the Magdeburg Press that got subsumed nicely under 1517, was the hermeneutical text used by Lutherans for centuries, even into the American setting. He becomes a great scourer of manuscripts and actually was very important in some of the library work in Germany. And he wants to show that the gospel was confessed throughout church history. The Reformed tended to see a break in the Middle Ages. There's this great chasm, and the Lutherans emphasized the gospel was always there. Maybe it wasn't as clearly preached in some places, but there's a continuity in the church. And so before the show, Adam mentioned the Catalog of True Testimonies, where Flacius goes back and finds all these evidences of the gospel being preached, and also the papacy is the Antichrist, throughout history. And so it's the beginning of patristic work in many ways. And then church history, he begins writing church histories, but also he's one of the lead editors of the Magdeburg Centuries, which begin to take an approach to history that takes it, chronologically. He's really taken the Lotze approach and applying it to history. But chronologically instead of doctrinally. And so
epochs become a loci rather than, or time periods become a loci rather than a subject. So it's not going from war to famine, it's going time periods and then the topics within the time periods.
Yeah, and so he becomes critical in all these fields, and I honestly think, if it had not been for the later controversy that breaks out over original sin, would be a pretty celebrated figure. Interestingly, he does come up in Croatian history a fair amount as this guy who went and made the big time intellectually and academically in Germany in the 16th century.
He's one guy they sent to the show.
Yeah, but there will be people who do epistemology or stuff like this. The Clavis, his view of hermeneutics will come up, and one of the wonderful things about the clavis that I think is really helpful in the beginning part, which is what is put out by 1517, is let's let biblical language define the language of the church and not Aristotelian.
Yeah.
And he really goes through to get to how we should let that happen. And, I think this is a nice countermeasure to Lutheran scholasticism sometimes.
Does he develop that kind of as a reaction to Melanchthon, or is it just sort of...
I think, part of it is he is really shaped by Luther's early writings. And so there's, just the disputation against the scholastics or whatever, 1517.
Yeah.
But I also think, he is starting to see, especially as leading up to the formula, as things are being systematized, you are starting to have...
You bring Aristotle back in.
Yeah, and so he's reacting to that. And really, the controversy of original sin, he's sucked into a debate about is original sin an accident or a substance. And
so he goes Aristotelian and gets himself into trouble.
He should have just said, I'm not going to use that language.
Yeah.
And, an accident in Aristotelian thought is like chalk on my shirt, I can wipe it off, and I'm still me. Or my hair, I don't have as much as I had before. I'm still Wade. And a substance is, who I am. And so he says now later on he will say there's a formal and a material substance.
Right.
But it makes it seem as though God could be the creator of evil then. Or Jesus had sin.
Yeah. Melanchthon does the same thing in causes of conversion. Later on he parses out the different ways you can say cause.
Yeah.
For the same reason. So it's interesting that one of the big controversies that involve both of them fall back on their use and their understanding of Aristotelian categories that not everybody even in their time had clear ability with.
And he uses Luther's language, but he gets sucked into Aristotelian meaning.
Yeah, along these lines, Luther's hammering of Aristotle was really a matter of it is not to provide the substance for our understanding of the Trinity or anything else, but he was all in favor of it with taxonomy. And so, if you have a dogmatics, you're probably arranging it using Aristotle's taxonomy, but that's not a problem.
Yeah, I'm using David Anderson's book right now in a class I'm teaching at the university on Luther's epistemology, and he makes the distinction with Luther that Luther's not attacking reason; he's attacking, in a sense, formal philosophies or systems of philosophy or systems of logic. You could even say being imposed on the Scripture.
Yep.
But fully acknowledges that when speaking, right, and when communicating, and even when discerning what the Scriptures are saying, you're going to use reason, number one, and two, when speaking about it for taxonomy, you can use some of the categories, and you can use them well. Yeah. But the problem is when you do that flip around, and all of a sudden you have a particular, not philosophy generally, but a particular philosophy, right, Aristotelianism or whatever, and that gets pressed into the Scriptures so that there's a blurry spot there between, is this Aristotle or is this Paul? Right. And I can honestly say, just to lead off the Melanchthon Flacius conversation here, that's what Melanchthon starts to fall into in 1530s, is that you get Aristotelianism comes back in, so between the early editions of the Loci in the 1520s and the middle editions in the 1530s, Aristotelianism comes back in so much that there's this fuzzy spot between Melanchthon's explaining Evangelion here, and he's explaining it, and is this Aristotle or is this Paul? Right. And it gets even more confusing when he starts that particular locus by using classical examples to explain what it means, rather than going straight to say Romans 1:16 or Romans 10:17 or something like that. He's bringing in classical examples first. And that's, it seems like to me that and I'd say it's true even today, I don't know if we wanted to go this far, but when we go wrong, it's when we lose that tension, right? And there's no longer, we're no longer real careful about how we're using reason, and we're allowing philosophies. Adam says it a different way, and I like the way you say it. Dogmatisms, what's your phrase that you use? Ideologies. We allow ideologies to sort of get pressed into the text. We're no longer just doing our best to use our reason to both exposit and proclaim the text accurately, but we're now so bought into another quote-unquote system or philosophy that we can't really tell the difference between the two.
Yeah.
I think the the episode before this that we just recorded when Rod was hitting a little bit on the election controversy. Lutheranism or Christianity loses something when we don't at least somewhat revel living in the tensions. That if we ever lose where there's an age where we think we've just got this too clean, we're maybe missing out on it. It doesn't preach as well, but
well, it's a very important point because, for instance, when I grew up in Lutheran pietism, and it was smooth from justification to the Christian life, one of the reasons I, with my scientific training, had reservations was because of the smoothness of it.
Yep.
Well, you could say the same, and we probably need to go to break, but I think you could say the same thing, and I think it's being fair. Correct me if I'm wrong. You could say the same thing of confessional Reformed and Calvinist, right? That one of the issues that you have with it is everything. I used to say, it's like when you're teaching a child how to tie their bow onto their shoe in the first point, right? It gets tied, and there's sort of there's enough tension there so that you can wear your shoe and your shoe's not falling off, and the one ear might be bigger than the other one or whatever, but that's just the way it is, and you go and you work with it. Or you can sit there and pull on each one until each one's exactly even, and you feel like you have this perfect balance, and you got it all figured out. And I sometimes feel like that's what goes on in confessional Reform circles. It's not that that they necessarily are putting this greater emphasis on reason or anything like that, or that they're even cognizant of it, but that it feels like everything has to be so clean and figured out and sort of working out perfectly with the way I view or the way we understand, say, formal logic or things like that, or axioms and things like that. And all of a sudden the scriptures become axiomatic in a formal logic sense, and not just in the sense of actually revealed word of God. That's going to have some messy tensions for us, for we sinners.
Yeah, I mean, even Jesus, anytime somebody thinks they have anything figured out all the way in the New Testament, every time shows them they know, they don't have it.
Yeah.
You don't have it together. You don't understand the law like you think you do.
There's another side to it, too, that's worth noticing. I spent 2 awful years at a liberal Lutheran seminary. Now, liberal Lutheran is almost an oxymoron, but still, for us, it was liberal, for a lot of us. And there you find paradox used to the detriment of the Orthodox faith.
Right.
Yep.
That's right.
And
so much so that you can't communicate clearly.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's worth keeping in mind. Those who dance a jig over paradox and consider themselves Lutheran, just know that can be used. The other side of that can be used.
Yeah. I've gone away from that language because I don't think what we're talking about is actual paradox. I think it's tension.
Yeah,
right?
That's better.
I think tension is better, and that that's why I use the example of the bow. There's enough tension there that the shoe still works, and you can understand the operation of the shoe and so on and so forth. But it's not paradoxical. To have one ear of your bow longer than the other is not a paradox. It's it's in tension, and maybe the tension seems unbalanced here or unbalanced there. But the fact is that some of these things that we're told in the scriptures we believe because they're from the mouth of Christ or from the mouth of the apostles. And then if you want to know why we hold that in such high esteem, refer back to the 22 episodes we did on apologetics. Christ is God and how he testifies about the Old Testament and the New Testament that would come after his resurrection and ascension. And so, that's different than saying paradox. We can't understand anything, which is absurd.
And I think that, the tension it preaches it. I mean, the two words, law and gospel, one needs to be election. These are things that need to be emphasized in settings. The election to the believer, stress that. God has chosen you. Well, what about the unbeliever? We're not talking about that. We're talking to you. And so that's what I mean by the tension.
What I tell my students on that is if the whole room explodes in laughter, you're probably pretty close to our position. Because they'll all be thinking that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
I always tell students, and Caleb's going to have an aneurysm if we don't go to a break, but I always tell my students when I'm teaching that there's three positions on this that, classically there's 3 positions on this. They probably have variations. On predestination, they probably have variations in between. 2 are going to make a lot of sense to you, and 1 is ours.
All right. I am going to have an aneurysm. No, just kidding. We're going to go to our break. We'll come back with a quick advertisement, and then we'll finish up this show. Welcome to our break. We have Wade Johnston on the show. He's the author of 2 books at 1517 Legacy. The first book that he published with us is called An Uncompromising Gospel. You might have heard about it on the last show. If you haven't, you should go back and listen to the whole last show because it talks about both the books you've published with us. But the second half is in particular about an uncompromising gospel. It's a historical book. It's written at the lay level, I think, right? Yeah, it's accessible by pretty much everybody, and it covers some of the controversies in later Lutheranism that Flacius is involved with, right? So maybe you could give like a 2-minute, what's the book about, why you should buy it?
No, the book starts with what it's called Luther's Uncompromising Gospel, or what the core of Luther's gospel is, which is, as I sometimes tell people, Christ was crucified for sinners, deal with it. That, this is the case. It's just a gospel that has no ifs, ands, or buts. And it gets to then, after Luther's death, some of the controversies that broke out about things like original sin, that we're born sinful. Do we have a free will? And if so, in what instances? Are good works necessary for salvation? How are we justified? The basic stuff that Luther had covered in his early works, and shows how it was resolved, and gives lessons both doctrinal but also just how we deal with each other within the church that maybe would be helpful for our own day. So I think lay readers, I think pastors as a supplement to some of their other books on the confessions, it can be a helpful work.
I think especially in this year, 500th anniversary of the Reformation, there's a lot of churches doing Reformation Bible studies right now, and this would be a great kind of historical work of later Lutheranism to kind of cover like what comes out of the Reformation.
Yeah. And I know some that have done that, and so far I've heard positive things.
You can get that at shop.1517legacy.com. If you go to our website, if you buy an order of $20 or more, you get free shipping. If you want to do a bulk order of those books for a Bible study, you can email me. It's on the contact page. You go to thinkingfellows.com, you hit the contact. You can tell me that you want to get that order, and I'll set up a bulk discount order for you for your church and your Bible study. Just let us know. So again, that's shop.1517legacy.com. I will put that link in the show notes for you. So want to transition into the next part of the episode? We kind of talked about some of the background and history.
We had some fun conversations. I want to know, let's talk about a little bit the controversies that occurred between Flacius and Melanchthon. Why don't you set the stage and we'll go from there.
Sure. I think if it weren't for political developments in Germany following Luther's death, there is a good chance there's no dispute between Melanchthon and Flacius. I do think under the pressures of political developments, namely the emperor invades, there's kind of this re-Catholicizing agenda with first what's called an Augsburg interim or law that the emperor in a letter to someone admits as a first step towards bringing them back into the Catholic Church. And then a compromise, I don't want to get lost in names and dates, but the new prince or leader of the part of Saxony that Wittenberg was in realizes he's just took the spot of his cousin, the rightful prince. He can't push the people too far. So a compromise is drawn up by many of the men who had known and worked with Luther to kind of buy time. So we're not going to give up as much, but still some stuff. And even the article on justification is not so good. But this is done under pressure of, is there going to be a University of Wittenberg? Is there going to be a Lutheranism? In southwest Germany, Lutheran pastors are being persecuted terribly. That's closer to the lowlands,
right.
The Habsburg,
We're talking imprisonment. We're talking death in some cases.
Yep.
We're talking about actual persecution.
Yeah, and I mean, now your preacher is gone, your pastor is gone. He's been removed from his parish and someone else is put in the place. And so you have extreme pressures that are playing in. And Melanchthon takes the approach that we will compromise for now and do our best to retain the kernel of the Reformation. Melanchthon had always differed somewhat with some Lutherans on ceremonies, for instance. He would say the state can institute some ceremonies. For instance, the state could say we're going to fast on Wednesday to help the economy with this, or we're going to eat herring on Thursday to help the herring industry or whatever the case may be. I mean, he doesn't write about herring that I know of. But he's okay with some state involvement in such things. Flacius and the Gnesio Lutherans are going to come down on the side of the church needs to be free to determine such things for herself. And so Melanchthon is in Wittenberg, which is very much now the heart of all of this. And Flacius finds his way throughout Germany looking for a home to be, because he published some stuff of Melanchthon's without Melanchthon's permission that had been involved in some of the deliberations leading up to the Leipzig Interim. I mean, it's even called that because Flacius gives it the title to identify it with Augsburg.
Yeah.
And he goes to Magdeburg, and Nicholas von Amsdorf, who is a very important Lutheran, and when Luther says, I did nothing but preach the word, or the word did everything, I just drank beer with Philip and Amsdorf, another good friend of Luther's. Amsdorf is in Magdeburg, and a fascinating guy himself. That's another episode for you guys maybe, but he says, come and here, work with us, we're opposing the interims. And Flacius says, he has a letter or a note where he says, I couldn't do it because all they eat is dried fish and bacon or something like that.
Yeah.
He had a Southern European diet.
Talk about herring.
He wasn't a PBR guy, I take it. Amsdorf's drinking PBR. And he tries some other places, and he ends up back in Magdeburg, which is actually put under siege eventually for opposing the interim. And Flacius publishes more than Luther even had published in any short span of time during those years. And, I mean, they're taking pamphlets and just throwing them, over the walls for fellow German troops to read and saying, why are you, going to war against fellow Lutherans? They are these pamphlets that can be easily carried are being taken throughout Germany and Europe. And it's a propaganda war is really what takes place.
Yeah. And they're behind the wall at this point, too. I mean,
right.
they're somewhat protected where most of the other Lutherans weren't, really.
Right, and there's I don't know. Oliver Olson, I think, has one of them in his book, so I'm tempted to think it's true, but I have not found it of, some of the Magdeburgers would dress up like women and go outside the walls, and the Spanish troops would be overcome with desire, and the Magdeburgers would cut them out and then run back in and things of this nature, but who knows how much of that is true.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and there's they're celebrating the service in church, and a cannonball comes through at one point, lands in the church. It doesn't explode. The pastor just kind of laughs and keeps going, with the service.
Mensch.
But this is an extended siege that's taking place, and so what the Magdeburgers essentially are doing is opposing the approach that not just Melanchthon but Wittenberg had taken on how to deal with these new laws that Melanchthon says are about adiaphora, or in different things that are not commanded or forbidden. And so Flacius is going to say, A, some of them are not adiaphora.
I.e. justification.
Right. And B, some things aren't adiaphora once they're commanded, right, or by force or persecution.
Right. And again, as we said earlier, this is the eventual position that the Formula of Concord takes. They take Flacius' position on this, saying the same thing.
Yep. Even Calvin will write to Melanchthon, by the way, too, and say, you need to be more firm on this. This was not a popular position abroad either among Protestants, but what people don't realize is Melanchthon's in the middle of all of it, with intense both political and churchly pressures. Yeah,
I mean, he's seen people that he knows, his friends, colleagues, taken away, put into exile, imprisoned.
Yeah.
It's a tough position to be in, and he doesn't really, at this point, at least in his mind, I'd say, have the benefit of being able to go and hide behind the wall.
Right.
He's seen. I mean, Luther dies, and like we said earlier, Luther dies, and everybody looks at Melanchthon. In a lot of ways, he's sitting there wondering who's standing behind him.
Sure.
And there's no one there, and it's not a position that I think, through reading much of his correspondence, that he relishes at all. He is not the leader that Luther is. He knows it. He's served a completely different function in the Reformation up until this point.
He hadn't run for district president.
He didn't, no. I mean, and Nestigan points out that after 1525, he was probably in a lot of ways better known than Luther through his writings and through people using the Loci and his Greek grammars and the school reforms and things like that. And but still, this is not his position. Now, he had served. I mean, he gets overall a bad rap for being a compromiser,
Right.
and generally throughout his career, which is somewhat true, right?
And a lot of that goes back to Bente, though, too, as we mentioned, I
Yeah.
think, in the last episode.
Yeah, and some of it's true. But I think it's great. One of the best pieces of Melanchthon research that's come out in a long time was Bob Kolb, pointing out specifically that we tend to look at this from our historical perspective and say, look at Melanchthon went over there and talked to those guys, and he gave on this doctrine or that doctrine, an inch further than we think he should have given. But we don't really take into account the pressure that he was on to go talk to those guys in the first place.
Sure.
That his prince or his elector was calling him in and saying, get on your donkey, go over there and figure this out, because eventually the emperor is coming up and we need them as our allies. I mean, the concessions that were offered even to Henry are sort of amazing, all for the sake of, would you please join the small Chaldicke League?
Right. And during Luther's lifetime, Luther's kind of delegating that role to Melanchthon, too. I mean, it's left to Melanchthon to help douse some of the fires of the bridges that Luther sets afire with.
Luther
rhetoric.
acknowledges that. I'm reckless. I tear up bushes and thorns and thistles, and I leave it to Master Philip to come behind me and make a nice, tidy road.
Yeah.
He gets that. But it's an interesting thing. I mean, I think one of the one of the things that we don't understand, the correspondence where you get a lot of this sort of vitriolic back and forth between characters is not available to most English readers because it's untranslated. But if you read it, even having sort of a passive knowledge of the fact that this is a very polemic age, you read it and it's strong stuff. I mean, Flacius, he's got a tongue on him.
Yep.
But so did Luther.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is one thing and I will say in the propaganda during the Adiaphoristic controversy, Flacius is much more tame about naming individuals or calling out individuals. He'll talk about Adiaphorus or Intramus. But
Philippus.
But when we do get 10, 20 years later, and Flacius has endured controversy after controversy, many of them that he's on the right side of that the formula will take. Right.
He's worth noticing.
Yeah, about 6 months of this pressure, I would have been a very bitter man writing angry blogs.
Right.
He goes 20 years.
Yeah, he made it longer than I would have.
So that's no small thing.
Yeah. So you said you alluded to sort of this. Really, it's called a heresy that he falls into. That Flacius falls into, the Flacian controversy, the Flacian heresy. What is that?
What had happened is Flacius was important for the founding of the University of Jena, after who had been the elector of Saxony was taken captive and put in prison, and his sons get Jena and they want to start a university, and Flacius comes and he becomes one of the most important faculty members. He gets a higher salary than some. His opponent in the original sin debate complains he gets to march further ahead in the faculty parade, whatever the case may be. But
I've heard Adam say that same thing like 5 times, so don't listen to him snicker.
I like being in the back because I can make snide comments and no one notices. But anyways, a debate, a discussion among the faculty comes out about original sin, and Flacius says, why don't we just debate this out? We'll talk it out. And in the debate, Aristotelian language comes in where his opponent, Stregel, says, is this an accident or a substance? And Flacius, thinking of Luther's nature-sin language, he's using Luther's language, but now he's trapped by Aristotle, says it's a substance, which means it's not like chalk that I can wipe off. It's part of me, who I am as a human being, which is problematic on 2 parts, because did God then create us with sin? And did Christ have original sin? Flacius denies these things and later will say, no, there's there's a formal substance and material substance, but by then it's far too late to undo the damage. His fellow Gnesio Lutherans write to him. They're saying, look, just say this isn't the best language. And I'm convinced his position is not as extreme as it sometimes has been painted in our circle. Sometimes you hear people dismiss something as Flacian when it's really someone's just taking original sin and its implications seriously. Because Americans don't like original sin.
Well, right. I mean, his intent is to say that this is a deep problem, that you're dead in your sin.
Right.
And he goes too far. And I often think like accidents and substance or essence, and you could, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you could even say that it's accidental to a man that he has two arms.
Right.
He could lose an arm and still be considered a man.
Yep.
And it's not, so that's, if you're thinking of accidents only in a sense of like chalk that you can wipe off, an accident can actually go deeper than that.
Absolutely.
It can be a part of who you are. So
Right.
it is a part of me that I have two arms, but it's not my essence, right? If I
Right.
lose one arm, I can still be me. But it's deeper than if I have something on my shirt. It's
Right.
and I think that's the trap. I think that's the trap that he fell into. He actually took the word accident and thought of it as chalk on the arm rather
Right.
than something that is still a part of you, right?
Right.
My arm, my feet, my legs, whatever. It's still a part of me. It's still who I am. And if you say it in that sense, original sin can still be a deep, deep problem that
Yeah.
you're dead in.
And we have
And-
hymns that emphasize that.
And
yeah.
be accidental in the Aristotelian sense.
Mhm. Good point.
And in the backdrop, for
Which
this-
is what
yeah.
Melanchthon's issue with him always is that he just doesn't have a as formal of an understanding of these things as he ought to be writing the way that he does. Even Melanchthon, having a tongue himself, even makes fun of his Latin on multiple occasions and how bad it is. So
Well, and I was just going to say, I think you mentioned earlier in this episode, hopefully I'm not confusing them, Melanchthon and the three causes of conversion.
yeah. Or as Lowell Green would say, 3, really 4.
Yeah, and Flacius is reacting precisely to that.
Yeah.
This is coming out of a time when the will in conversion or in the Christian life is being debated, and he sees the door through which people are trying to bring that in as a
Yeah.
diminishment of original sin, which is interesting because Erasmus, in writing against Luther, says he overinflates original sin too much.
Right.
So whenever people try to bring the will in, original
Right.
sin must be deflated.
Right, which is a mistake. Melanchthon did that. I mean, he calls your will a cause of your conversion. He's using it in the Aristotelian sense. He's using the material cause, which means the thing that is changed.
Mhm.
It's not the efficient cause. It's not the formal cause. It's not the final cause. It's not any of the things doing the movement, but it's literally the thing being changed, right? If we're talking about moving my phone and I pick it up and move it from here to here, the phone had nothing to do with it, yet it's still a material
Right.
cause there. But still, if you don't understand that, all you hear is your will is a cause of your conversion.
Right.
And that's a problem.
And the old man's going to jump on that.
And the old man's going to jump on that, and it is going to be a door to greater error than Melanchthon intended, or in the Flacian controversy case, than Flacius ever intended with what he was saying. And that's the danger when you superimpose a particular philosophy or particular system on the scriptures, and you assume, which is a bad assumption, that everybody understands these terms
Yep.
as thoroughly as you do. And man, did Melanchthon ever fall into that trap time and time again. He was so educated, I think he honestly believed that everybody, he was making things clearer.
Yep.
When many times he was making them less clear.
Well, and both of these men are laymen, or, well, I don't think they're laymen, but that's it for another episode. They're not ordained. And
At least in the sense that we think of that today.
right, and
Yeah.
I've got more of a free pass with our Wisconsin Synod Doctorate of Ministry than some of my friends do in Missouri because we're more open to that. But they're not pastors. And Melanchthon, I think, one of the things that happened with Melanchthon is they do the visitations, and Melanchthon and both Major are taken aback by what they find in the parishes. Luther knows what's in the parishes, or he's more familiar as a pastor.
Not as surprised.
And Flacius, is not in the parishes necessarily either. And so both of them are able of dealing with these things as sometimes detached concepts that are not rooted in the pulpit or in the mutual consolation of brethren, of
Right.
dealing with actual people, which
Right.
hopefully every layperson,
Yeah.
their theology is ultimately tested when you've got someone coming to you
Right.
in theological crisis. And so I think this plays into it too of, these are, when they're conceptions and it's not rooted
Yep.
in how it comes to the Christian, and then you get Aristotle in there just for fun, and it gets difficult.
My friend Bob Hiller likes to say there are no theological abstractions when the pastor is visiting the dying person in the
Yep.
hospital room.
Yep.
And I think that's, in a sense, I know Melanchthon's lacking that
Yep.
that conception. And I know Luther's not. I would guess the same is true with Flacius.
Well, and who's, often at the deathbed, I found in 10 years of parish ministry, is Erasmus has been sitting by the bed. And so
Yeah.
you have the member who says, who's been in church and heard the gospel for 80 years, and says, Pastor, I don't know if I've been good enough to go to heaven, and I have to say, I'm sure you haven't, and let them marinate on the fact that they might be burning in hell for a minute or two, and then you say, let's talk about Christ. Or even with faith, when we want to insert the will and make that a cause, Pastor, I'm sure I don't have enough faith, and once again the same answer is, I'm sure you don't. Let it marinate, and let's get back to Christ. And when these things become too much an abstraction, too much conception, it's good, especially for us in pastoral ministry. Go hear some confessions. Go visit people. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have to end. Hey, Wade, I could do 5 more of these with you. That was fun.
Well, I appreciate it.
Thanks
I enjoyed
for
it.
flying down. And thanks for writing these books and publishing them with 1517. We appreciate it. It's resources like this that really fulfill why we exist.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for listening. If you don't already, you should go subscribe to the show on iTunes or your favorite podcasting app. I'll put links in the show notes on the website to iTunes podcasts where you can subscribe there. And go like us on Facebook and Twitter so you can see when the latest episodes drop. We'll catch you next time. Bye.